turn on recording so we can have an archive. So we should be going now. And without further ado, I think we'll get going. So a quick reintroduction. Thanks again for joining us today for our first Lunch and Learn of 2021. My name is James Murphy. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for UGA Extension in Rockdale County. And today's topic, we will be covering seed starting basics. So this is something I try and keep my Lunch and Learns rather timely because I think that's the best time to get information is when you can use it. Now is the time of year, if you're curious about seed starting, you've heard about it, or maybe you've done it before, but you just want a little more pointers. This is the time of year when we're really looking into getting into seed starting. So just a little bit of a primer before we get into the nuts and bolts of seed starting. We are talking about an aspect of plant biology today, specifically that reproductive step. So plants reproduce in all manner of different ways. Some of them are asexually. They're able to produce without having to interact with another counterpart plant of the same species. But in the case of what we're looking at today, this is going to be a type of sexual reproduction or a combination of genetic material that produces a plant embryo, which we call a seed. So you can see here we've got a hypothetical legume, a type of bean plant, and this is a common sort of experiment or a showcase that you may have seen done maybe even as far back as elementary school or middle school. I think that's about when we did this. We did sort of a basics of how to get a seed going. But you can basically see here that, again, that cross section shows in there is this little embryo, and you have in there what we call cotyledons, which are our seed leaves, which are important. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But the entirety of our seed starting practice is basically everything that takes place to the right of that second orange arrow down there. So actually down there in the soil where we get root production, and eventually we get some upward growth and some production of leaves, and then eventually a transition into a more rapidly growing and eventually a mature plant. So all of this practice is basically going to be everything over to the right of that arrow again today. So what are the basics of seeds needs? What things do seeds need to be successful? So all living things require certain things in order to not only be happy and be healthy, but to be successful in their eventual goal of survival and reproduction. So in this case, when we're again talking about the beginning of this life cycle, the basic needs of our seeds are essentially these four little things that I have here just kind of illustrated on this screen. So this is some of the things that whether you're starting seeds or you're gardening that you should keep in mind at all times, because keeping these things in balance is oftentimes the key to keeping things happy and healthy. So water, I think, is obvious. Water, and more importantly, water in the proper amount is one of the most important things when it comes to growing plants successfully. Beyond that, oxygen. So I think many folks think of photosynthesis as requiring carbon dioxide, but when we're talking about the beginnings of seed germination, oxygen is equally important because it's necessary, again, for this germination or metabolic process of getting started. Next, we have light. Of course, conventionally, that would be sunlight. However, the beauty of seed starting and with modern technology is sometimes we can sidestep the need of sunlight and we can use alternate methods, and that helps us to actually do a bit more growing when maybe the sun isn't so available. And the last is proper temperature, and this feeds into another factor that we'll talk about here in just a second. So you'll see the one thing that I didn't mention on that slide, which I think comes to mind in the case of most plants, is of course soil. So soil is incredibly important, but when we're talking about seed starting, it's important to remember that not all soils are necessarily created equally. This is true of soils that are found naturally in our landscape, but it's also true of things that are sold commercially, bagged or boxed that would be used for the growth of plants. So we'll talk a little bit more specifically about it, but you'll see here over on the left, we have kind of a rough, coarse, maybe more natural material. It is, a decent amount of organic matter, but you see it's very irregular and it's probably very heavy and may not drain quite as well versus something that we have here over the right that's very fine. It's got some perlite or other inorganic matter in there to help with drainage. And you can see there's a definite difference between these two, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important just a little bit later. So I'm sure you've joined this talk because you're interested in the topic of seed starting, but maybe you haven't fully gathered, why one would want to consider seed starting. So there are, of course, your philosophy or your reason is ultimately up to you, and however important you consider that. You may have a reason here that's not listed, but these are generally what I think are kind of the major pros and cons of seed starting. So for pros, I would say the biggest one is just a greater choice in variety. And as we'll talk about with seed starting resources or seed banks, seed libraries, seed categories, or catalogs, excuse me, having more choice is maybe the biggest sell of starting your own seed, is that simply when you're going to a store, you're going to a nursery, or maybe something like a big box store, you're going to be restricted to what the growers or the suppliers, the stockers have decided are the ones that sell the best or are the easiest for them to maintain at point of sale until they get into your hands. Stepping outside of that, you open up a wide world of different things that you can choose that can definitely incur more challenges depending on what you choose, but it gives you that freedom of choice, which I think is the biggest sell overall. Beyond that, these next 2 points kind of go hand in hand as far as extending your season or increasing your efficiency. So if you've taken the leap from maybe, just starting off gardening and, buying a plant from a store and trying to keep it alive, and now you're in the full practice of gardening and you're, making selections and planting gardens and things like this, increasing your efficiency by seed starting and extending that season through the cooler months, which again, we're in right now, will allow you to get more for your time. And ultimately, if you're an average gardener, we get to our last point here, our last pro, which is that it's hopefully more fun. It's more enjoyment. You get to do a bit more of this gardening at times of year when potentially there's not as much going on, or what's going on is mostly kind of boring maintenance, maybe weeding or maybe a bit of restructuring or preparation type steps. This can give you some of that thrill of active gardening, of seeing things grow. And I think that's really what sums up kind of the pros of it. The downsides, of course, not everything is sunshine and rainbows, though I wish it would be. Starting seeds does come with a cost. Some might tell you that, starting seeds is cheaper, which it certainly can be. In terms of a cost per plant ratio, you can bring that cost down, but when we're talking about additional equipment and your time investment, that's not free. There is a cost there. So you do have to take that into account if you're planning on getting into seed starting. You have to consider also that your overall yield may actually be lower depending on the varieties you choose and how well your seeds are started. So just because you get a high quality seed, if it's not cared for correctly, or if it's not planted correctly, or some hybrid varieties, conventionally sold hybrid varieties, are selected for their yield potential, you may end up with something that yields a little bit lower. And then something else I think is one of the major pitfalls, which we'll cover again a little bit later, is that you really have to stay on top of this daily. This is something you can't really start seeds super passively unless we're talking about casually sort of sowing things and just waiting to see what comes up. If you want to do this right, this is something that you're going to have to do regularly and stay on top of. Otherwise, you're going to run into issues. So this is just a quick little cheat sheet. Please don't worry about writing all this stuff down because there's obviously a lot of stuff here, but I do want y'all to be aware of some of the plants that we recommend direct sowing, that is things we wouldn't consider starting versus things that we would consider starting. So a lot of our direct sowing stuff, and you'll see some of this stuff here isn't necessarily super great even to grow in our region, things like artichokes, stuff like that. Typically is going to be things that are a lot of our root veggies are not super happy to. A lot of our leafy greens, again, the seeds are so small that they're not necessarily necessary. And this is true even for some of our herbs as well. However, things that we would start indoors are a lot of our more conventional veggies. So things like in our solanaceous group, so a lot of our peppers, our eggplants. We do have some greens in here, some things like our bok choy, our broccoli. And then again, in that kind of solanaceous group, we have things like tomatoes and even some cucurbits, even though they can be a little bit tricky. But really, a lot of our herbs are super happy to be started indoors, and this can be a great way to get a jump start on your herb garden. So just as a basic checklist, here's a few things that you're going to need, and we'll get a little bit more in detail as we go through the talk. But for starters, you want good quality seeds, some type of containers to put those seeds in, soilless seed starting media. So I know we mentioned soil earlier, but you see this is soil-less seed starting media. So it can be a type of soil, but in this case, this is going to be something a little bit different. You will need to monitor that soil temperature, or at least have a way of measuring or ensuring that soil is at a certain temperature. And again, some type of light. So here's a few pitfalls of seed starting, a few kind of common points of failure. So I already mentioned this on a previous slide, but I think whether it's seed starting or whether it's sort of gardening or home horticulture in general, too much water is often the failing point. And I think it's just because, again, if you've reached this point of gardening, maybe you just love your plants too much. And I totally get that. You're excited about it. You're looking forward to taking care of them. And so it turns you into a helicopter plant parent. You are constantly circling, which it's good to be attentive, but it's bad if you end up adding too much, especially while our plants are very small and they're going to be overly sensitive to too much water addition and maybe the disease or pest issues that can accompany that. Some of the other problems are contamination. We'll talk about that with our containers in just a little bit. Not enough light. I think this is, again, when we have people that maybe you want to take up seed starting, but you don't want to spend the money on grow lights or anything like that. So you hope you can just use something like a windowsill. You can use a windowsill, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, it's not necessarily ideal. Over-fertilization is also fairly common. I think for the same reasons that overwatering is common, that, folks sometimes think that, if a little is good, a lot is better. But again, when these plants are so small, they can be so sensitive, and they are unfortunately prone to damage with too much fertilizer. So now we're going to jump into the actual sort of topic at hand, and these are our actual seeds. So we'll talk about sort of where to acquire them later. I'll give you guys a few resources, but one of the things that I do really want to mention is our seed labels, or our seed packets, I guess. So unless you are getting true hand-me-down seeds, and I do mean that, an heirloom variety that you're getting from a neighbor or a friend or a family member that's, saved these for generations, you're going to get them in something that looks roughly like this picture that I have over here. And this is the back of our packet. The front typically is going to have either a picture or an illustration of the type of plant with maybe a little bit of additional info. But you can see here, this is the back of our label for some USDA organic registered Amish paste tomatoes. This is an heirloom indeterminate variety. It's an annual, and the fruits, when they are grown correctly, should be 5 to 7 ounces. So there's a ton of information in that first little line already. But you can see here we've got quite a lot in here as far as propagation timelines, how much soil and water, or rather the type of soil and how much water, and harvesting, as well as potential seed storing. So there's so much information, and that's why if you are starting the journey on getting your seeds started, we have resources here at UGA Extension to support and give you additional information, but more often than not, that information should hopefully be provided by the seed packet of what you've purchased. So I would absolutely recommend, when maybe even before you make a final purchase, to take the time to read through these seed packets to make sure that what you're planning on growing is going to suit your needs, and also that you can provide for that plant. We always preach the sort of motto of right plant, right place, and this label will definitely help you with that. A couple other little rules of thumb. So when you're doing your planting, people always ask this question, how deep should I plant things? So most seeds should be planted about 2 times as deep as the widest part of the seed. So You know, if a seed is circular, that makes it fairly easy. If a seed is oblong, you know, if it's got one axis or one side that's longer than the other, you want it to be about 2 times as deep as that widest part. And that's in order to make sure that it's, you know, fully covered, it gets good soil contact, but it's not completely buried. It still has access to that oxygen and water that it needs. Another good rule of thumb is that the shelf life of seeds is typically 2 to 5 years, and this will depend on what exactly you're looking at. And that's another benefit of saving these seed packets and keeping them on hand rather than just dumping out all the seeds and throwing away the packet. They'll have that date on there, which should be, again, an easy way to kind of keep tabs on things and know if your seeds are still good. So I have gotten questions on seed saving in the past, which I think is a practice that often dovetails quite nicely with the practice of seed starting. So generally speaking, here's a few more kind of rules of thumbs. For vegetable seed starts, you do not want to save hybrid seed. And so this is either from hybrid varieties, from starts that maybe you've gotten from a big box store. You know, if you've got your Better Boys or your Big Boys or things like that, if something is a true hybrid variety, or this would be, you know, probably from things that you've gotten from a grocery store. So a lot of the commercial varieties are hybrids rather than heirlooms. And the thing is that more often than not, these seeds will not be even viable, or if they are viable, they're not necessarily going to be true to type. So really, it's better to just save yourself the trouble and to instead, you know, go for, if you want to start seeds, just start with seeds that are already ready to go and are a variety, a high quality selected variety that you know that you want. If you do have heirloom varieties, on the other hand, here's a few strategies for tomatoes, peppers, peas, and beans as far as how you can save them. So tomatoes, you can remove them, put them in a container with water, and once those seeds sink, once they've absorbed enough water and sunk down to the bottom, you can strain them out, dry them, and then save them. For peppers, you basically let them dry on the plant, remove those seeds, and then again fully dry them. And for our peas and beans, leave them on just like our peppers, and once they start to rattle around, usually that'll take a while, then you can actually dry those pods an additional couple weeks before shelling and saving. For our flowers and ornamentals, we want to wait for those petals to fall and expose that seed head. So you see we've got some echinacea here. That's one of our exemplar plants, I think, that's great for seed saving because the seed head is just so readily available. It's right there. Once it's good to go, you want to then cut that below the seed head and then dry that in a paper bag. So eventually, if you give that a long enough time, the sort of herbaceous matter of the flower will dry down. It will yield that water, and those seeds should just easily pop out. Just another note on seed saving, you always want to label your seeds. You know, especially this is true if you have an heirloom variety and you don't have the luxury of something like a seed packet to guide you on best practices. You can also make notes on this. You know, it doesn't have to be just a name. You can say, you know, how long it took you to start, how much fruit you got off of it. This is a great way to kind of keep track of things, when you planted it, all sorts of things like that. But when you're storing your seeds, you want to make sure it's a cool, dry place. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend, you know, up underneath a sink or a countertop where you do a lot of, you know, maybe work with water or any cleaning supplies or anything like that, because you don't want to have anything with too much humidity. Indoors is obviously preferable. If it's something like an outbuilding, like a shed or something, something that is, you know, as sealed from the environment is probably preferable, so you don't get too much exposure, again, to potential things like moisture or mold. So like I said earlier, seed shelf life can vary greatly. Some things are very short-lived, like our corn, parsley, pepper, or onions. Some things are a bit more intermediate, and some things are actually quite a bit longer. So again, that should be on your seed packet to give you a sense, but this is, again, just kind of a little bit of a rule of thumb. If you are curious about your seed viability, you can do what we call a seed viability test. So if you don't have that packet, or you know, you're not sure, or maybe it's on the borderline, you can take these seeds and you can actually line them up on a damp paper towel and then put them someplace nice and dark. and then come back a couple days later and see if you've got any root activity. If you're lucky and they're still viable, you should see some roots. These actually over here on the left have probably gone quite a bit too long. You should see something more like over here on the right, where we've gotten just a little bit of growth started. I know this is a wall of text on this page, so I'm not necessarily going to cover it all in detail, but scarification and stratification are two terms you may run into when you're trying to start seeds, whether they be vegetables or ornamentals. And so this is just a basic breakdown of what those terms mean and the kind of practices that go along with it. So scarification is a disruption of the seed coat, that natural seed coat that surrounds that outer layer of the kind of shell of the seed itself. And that disruption basically causes the germination process to kickstart. It gets it going. And so this practice can sometimes happen naturally just through seeds moving their way through the environment, or sometimes even when they move their way through an animal, maybe that's eaten the fruit or eaten the seed, but they prove themselves indigestible, but that move through that pathway is enough to get that seed shell, that seed coat ready to go. So if this is something you need to do, it will be recommended, again, on that seed packet or that seed label. So don't feel like you have to do this for every single seed before you plant it. Stratification is a process basically by which, again, that process of germination is kickstarted, or it is encouraged by a period of cold and damp. So you can naturally stratify basically by sowing seeds in the fall. So again, these seeds, they need some period of cold and wet and dark in order to properly get started. So you can do this naturally, but of course, then you lack a lot of control in that sense if you just throw them out in a bed and you kind of hope for the best. However, you can also do this in your refrigerator, and this is basically by putting them into something like a seed starting mix, or in some cases, things like playground sand, and basically cover and moisten, and then you want to leave that in your refrigerator for about, anywhere from just a few weeks to up to a couple months, and then check on that moisture. And then from there, you can basically kind of check on it until you start to see root activity, and then you can start the seed starting practice or the transplanting practice from there. So now I want to talk a little bit about containers. So I think, as with many garden practices, containers are one of those things that it's not kind of a one size fits all. It'll depend on your priorities. It'll depend on your resources, and it'll depend on just purely what you have available to you. I think the most conventional ones are our little sort of seed starting flats here. You can see we've got, I think it's about a 5x10 flat, probably about an inch on each side of these individual little cups. These are commercially made, and they're usually relatively inexpensive. And I think if you're serious about seed starting, this is probably the best way to go. Because, they are made for a purpose. You're not trying to sort of hack something into place. However, if you're, if you don't want to spend the money, or you're of the mindset of wanting to be more of an upcycler or a recycler, which I totally support, you can use any number of things. You can see here we've got ice cube trays. We've got some sort of plastic lunch containers. I know milk cartons and things like that, they can be used. The key here is we have a few main tenets that you need. So the first one is that they be clean. And so generally, I caution against reusing them unless you sanitize. And that's one of the points that we have here. So sanitization is really key in that, that cleanliness is absolutely crucial to ensuring that, again, our sensitive, small little plants have as little competition in the form of pest and disease loads coming out of the gate. Another thing that's important, I've talked about water already a couple times, is that we have good drainage. We have enough drainage so that water can naturally flow through, that we don't end up with our poor little plants just soaking wet, and again, promoting issues like environmental problems, like root stress, or fungal problems that can lead to things down the line. You'll see down here in the corner, I've got kind of one of these tabletop setups that I'm sure you've seen advertised. Maybe I don't know how many people have been too much airline travel lately, but this is one of those things that seems like one of those in-flight magazines or maybe like a sharper image type thing. I am skeptical of these types of setups. I think if only because the cost to benefit ratio, I'm not sure how much is really there. I think in the application that they're showing here, it's probably not super worth it. I think it's a little restrictive for what you're wanting to do. If you're trying to do something maybe on the realm of just growing maybe microgreens for a kitchen, and you are constantly kind of harvesting very small amounts, either greens or little sprouts, maybe a setup like this might be okay for a small footprint and something that you're constantly going to be using. But for something that's going to be a little more dedicated for seed starting, I just don't think the cost to kind of size ratio or utility factor is really there for this particular type of setup. So we mentioned soil, or rather lack thereof, not too long ago. And so when we're talking about what our seeds are actually going into, we'll usually call it a seed starting media. So rather than a potting soil or a seed starting mix, or a soil-less mix. And so the key here is, again, we want to get all of those characteristics of, fine texture, good drainage, and able to kind of nurture that brand new root system in such a way that we can then move it to its new living space quite easily without disturbing it. So you can do this any number of different ways. I think the most conventional, again, is to use something like a seed starting mix, but there are a number of other commercially available items as well. So something like this peat pellet that we see over here, they come as little pucks. And once they expand, they then hold lots of water, and you can put 1 or 2 medium-sized seeds in there. We also have things like our cocoa coir plugs. This basically serves a similar function. And so really, again, it's whatever's kind of in your cost ratio or cost budget, and what's available to you. I don't think there's any one way to do this, but it's whatever works best for your practice, so long as it meets those requirements of being for starting seeds rather than just being for larger, more mature plants. If you do want to DIY your own seed starting mix, I would recommend using something like this. So 2 parts of screened compost, again, to remove a lot of those larger chunks, 2 parts of leaf compost, and 1 part of perlite. And this is, again, to get that fine sifted material with a bit of inorganic matter to help with that drainage and allow those roots to get started. You can also add worm castings, either purchased worm castings, or if you have somebody does vermicomposting, or maybe you do it yourself. They're great for that nutrient, that's kind of slow release nutrient capability that they would add into your mix, but they're not necessary. They're not always necessary if you don't have access to them. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is, of course, temperature being a requirement. Folks are, they're asking me already, what time of year should I be planting? When can I plant? And it's one of those things that air temperature is part of the equation, but we really do need to pay attention to soil temperature. So talking about, our more mature plants, that's for another day perhaps, but for our seed starts, we typically want that soil to be anywhere from a minimum of 65 degrees Fahrenheit to up around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So this will depend, again, on your label. It should tell you, what you need to actually germinate those seeds at. I think fairly commonly you see in some of these kits or some of your checklist for starting your own seeds are heat mats, and these can be nice, but if you're growing these indoors, a typical house is at least 65 degrees. I know we keep ours maybe a little on the chilly side. My wife and I, we keep it around 66. That's still more than 65 degrees. However, if you're growing things in maybe something like an outbuilding, if you've got a shed or you're growing in a basement, having these mats can be useful to keep that soil temperature up. And if you're going to use them, I would recommend to just have them on all the time. There's no real reason to have these on a timer. It's probably good to have them on something like a circuit breaker or something like that, especially, you want to be mindful of how many things you're plugging into a single plug. But again, it's one of those things that I think is more optional than anything else. So this is maybe the biggest question outside of soil is light. If you're starting your own seeds, how can you go about it? So I think, again, if you're serious about it and you really want to start your own seeds, you want to have some type of artificial lighting setup. I think it is difficult to start your own seeds unless using natural light, unless you already live in a fairly ideal environment or you have kind of an ideal place to put them. Artificial lights give you a lot of control over it, and again, allow you to grow at times of year when maybe the situation is not so optimal. I know I've been rather sick of the number of gray and gloomy days we've had as of late, and so having these lights allows you to give your plants what they need a little bit earlier. And so you can see here we have what is maybe, I would hope, is more of a microgreen type setup, and in both cases because of how crowded these plants are. But down here, on the bottom left, you can see a light setup. Those are, maybe on the outside end of how far I'd want them to be away from those plants. So those are maybe a little bit too far, but generally we want them about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch above our emerging plants. If all you've got is a window, I would try and get a south-facing window. Here in the Northern Hemisphere during our growing season, our south-facing windows are going to get the majority of the sun. Just know that you're going to have to rotate them frequently. So you can see here we have plants exhibit what we call phototropism, so they will move towards the light. And you can see if you leave them in that position, they're going to get really bent and leggy as they try and seek that light. So you're going to need to rotate them probably daily in order to try and keep them growing in a somewhat upward fashion. This is something that maybe would be a little more ideal, and I think this is kind of a more off on the corner, getting started type setup. But you could certainly do this on a bench or a tabletop, like a workbench or just a flat top. If you have a space like a basement or a shed or something like that you're trying to make work for this. For your lighting, there's tons of options available. LEDs have really come down in price as of lately, though you certainly can spend an arm and a leg if you really want to. But conventionally, fluorescence still will work just fine. When I work down in Florida, this is typically what we used when we were growing some of our ferns. So the key here is that you want full spectrum lighting regardless. You want cool lighting as well as warm lighting. So either a bulb that offers a combination of both of those ends of the spectrum, or at least one of each in order to give that full spectrum. You can see here again, our lights are on kind of a chain setup, and that's again because they're going to need to be adjusted up every 2 to 3 days. You can see here, this is more of kind of an example setup, but otherwise these lights are way too high. Those would need to be much, much closer. So best setup would be using something like a baker's rack. So this is, you can get these at restaurant supply stores, but I know my wife and I, we got one that just from Walmart, not for use for seed starting, but for actual use of storing kitchen supplies, but we could turn it into a seed starting setup if we wanted to. And for our lights, these are something you would want to have on a timer. And so typically we would say you want to have these on like a 1410 or an 18.6 cycle. So another item that you might want to look into is a fan. So fans will offer several benefits. The biggest one with our increased airflow is less disease pressure. And so this is true, even for our landscape plants or some of our vegetables when they're planted outside, is that a lot of our disease pressure happens from times when we have high moisture or high humidity combined with low amount of airflow. So things that are kind of overgrown, overcrowded, things that haven't been pruned in a while really allow that situation for poor light penetration to get through and cause issues with fungus. The added benefit of that increased airflow is actually stronger stems too. So leggy starts are really the enemy of someone trying to be successful with seed starting. And this is similar for the reason that I mentioned rotating our plants. If you're using something like a windowsill for your source of light, having a bit of airflow, and this is not necessarily super strong, you don't want it on full blast, but just enough light airflow to caress across those is going to help encourage those stems to thicken up and to help them with nutrient transport from the roots to the leaves and vice versa. And eventually that'll make it much easier for these plants to be handled and transplanted if you expose them to a bit of a breeze early on in their growing cycle. So another item that is commonly asked about and was actually shown in one of the earlier slides are domes. So domes can be great. I don't think that they are always 100% necessary, especially because there's something that if you're using them correctly, they're typically only going to be used at the very beginning of your practice. but they're nice to have on hand because they may help accelerate things. And that's because they help to regulate both your temperature and your humidity. You are effectively making a micro greenhouse when you're putting these on your containers, whatever they may be. And again, these can be improvised. You can use all sorts of stuff to do this. It's just if you're buying those commercially available seed starting flats, they may or may not come with their own tops. The key here is that once you see green, so we're not even talking, getting to the point of seeing emerged cotyledons and certainly not emerged true leaves, you probably want to go ahead and remove them again so you can more carefully regulate the water to help keep fungus and things at bay, but also make sure they're getting enough light and access to that airflow again to help keep that stem nice and strong. So one thing people always are kind of gobsmacked when I say this, I think, is that, you're not going to keep all of the seeds that you start, which I think a lot of people see as counterintuitive. They say, well, what's the point of putting the seed in the ground if I'm not eventually going to grow it and make something out of it? And the truth is, this entire process is all about quality over quantity. If you have a big enough space, you can potentially do both. If you have big enough space and enough time and enough know-how, you can do high quality and high quantity. However, at that point, you're basically running a commercial operation. And if that's your practice and that's what you like to do, then let me know. I'll come buy some plants off you because that sounds really cool. But if you're just getting started, when you're starting these off and you really only want to put so many seeds in each individual cell. And so in this case, when we're talking small seeded things, things that are maybe only a couple millimeters wide, you might put 3 or 5 seeds in each individual cell. And we're talking larger things, maybe 2, 3 at the very most. And once those come up, you're basically going to select, and it may be arbitrary, or it may be just whatever, whichever one looks best. You're going to reduce those down to one remaining one that you will eventually transplant. This is to reduce competition because, again, those plants don't care about your end goal of growing them all into nice, beautiful plants. They all just want to survive. And so more plants in one place means more fight for resources, and it means they all suffer for it. And therefore, that competition can cause issues with stress and can cause issues with disease. And again, can cause issues with things being shaded out or being too crowded, which lead to conducive conditions for disease development. So on that note, once you've thinned and you've selected which ones are eventually going to make their way into your garden, then we get into actual transplanting. And so we have 2 levels of this kind of. First, we have what we call transferring. And this is when you get your first true leaves. So I mentioned the word cotyledon, I think, on our very second slide. And these are our seed leaves. These are the things that the plant uses basically to get some gas in the tank. And usually they are oblong, they're generic looking leaves. They don't look much like the plant truly looks like when it's fully grown. Our true leaves are going to be usually that second pair of leaves that emerge that actually resemble adult leaves. So that's when you want to transfer. That's when you want to move things maybe from your seed starting cell to something like a quart or half-gallon pot or something like that to get them started on their way to being outside. Transplanting formally is when you get several sets of those true leaves. And really what's more important here beyond the leaves is a nice strong root system. Getting that root system developed, again, through a practice of fertility management, of watering, is going to be critical to your success once they actually make their way into the garden. And this is something, of course, you can check on from time to time. Again, I encourage you to take a look at those roots and see how they're coming along as they work their way into the garden. So a note here on fertilization. So seeds from the get-go need everything, or rather have everything they need to get started. So you don't need to necessarily fertilize them out of the gate. Some seeds may come coated with things like fungicides. They may have seed treatments, but within the seed, if it is a healthy seed, it should have everything it needs to get going. Once you get those true leaves, again, after our cotyledons, then you can start a regular liquid feeding program. And so a lot of times this is something that will be indicated on your fertilizer. Again, going back to our labels, I know I sound like a broken record, but this is a great way to get an idea of what your plants will actually need. And it'll oftentimes be recommended. It'll say, you know, a seedling or a starting plant rate. But most of the time, what this comes down to is a dilute somewhere from 1/4 to half full strength rate with liquid general purpose fertilizer. So this would be our good old fashioned 10-10-10. You can use, you know, some things if you've made them yourself or you source them yourself. Fish emulsion, I know, is supposed to be quite good. It's nice and nitrogen heavy, even if, you know, it's a bit stinky, but, you know, if that's more in your practice, this is something I think, again, you could use, but again, you want to use it at something like 1/4 or a half rate. Hardening off. So this is a term I don't know if many folks have run into, but it's something that I try and encourage, again, especially at this time of year when our temperatures are somewhat unpredictable. And I like to relate this to if you've ever had a fish tank and you've ever gotten a new fish to put in it. You typically, it's not good practice to take that fish and just sort of dump it straight into the water, because that water is going to be a different temperature, it's going to have a different oxygen content, and it's just going to be a stressful experience. So we want to think of doing the same thing for our plants, where basically we're going to take anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. Once we get to the point where we're steadily holding at around 50 degrees during the daytime, and we're going to start slowly exposing our new plants to the environment. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that they're protected from wind. So whether this means putting them behind some type of barrier or just on a certain side of your house, maybe up against the house, just to keep them from drying down. Again, we want to make sure that they don't get too crispy and we don't ruin those nice root systems that we've really nursed along for the beginning of these plants' lives. But over time, so towards the end of this, or towards the end of that first week, or 10 days, 14 days, however long you feel like doing this for, you do want to allow them to kind of slowly dry down, to get used to that sensation of not having water or not having a moist root zone constantly. And so you want to work this up to around 4 hours of sun per day. And so you might start with 30 minutes, then go to an hour, then an hour and 15, or however you want to do it. But this is a great way to get your plants accustomed to that sensation. So we're getting close to wrapping up here, but I do want to touch on a couple common things that folks run into or things that you may see. And the first is a pest that I think is fairly common, really in our seed starts, but you see it in a lot of cases of indoor horticulture, house plants, things like that. And these are our fungus gnats. And these are a result of generally overwatering. So overwatering itself will stress your plants full stop, but you may start seeing these little critters start flying around, or you go to water your plants, or you go to thin them and you see a cloud of these guys come flying up. And when you start poking around in the soil, you see little grubs. So these things aren't actually eating the plants themselves, but they are eating the fungus that's developed in your soil. So in order to treat this, you want to try and back off on that watering, allow those roots to dry down. And again, you want to try and thin things out or move things around and make sure the canopy isn't shading your media and that the plants aren't overcrowded to help reduce the conditions conducive to these guys building up. You can use sticky traps. So these can be hung up. You can see one, we've got a fungus gnat right here that's stuck on a sticky trap. They are good for monitoring, but they're not necessarily going to do a ton for control, especially if you don't back off on that watering, if you don't allow things to dry down a little bit. They're not going to be successful for fully controlling. So sticky traps are not enough. I would probably have them up anyway as just a monitoring system. You can think of it as like an alarm system for your plants, just to see if you're starting to get an issue and to let you know maybe you're watering a bit too much. But just know that, again, the traps alone aren't going to do it for you. So another common issue we see is what we call damping off. And this is caused by a number of different fungal organisms, but the key here is that they're all soil-borne, and it's going to be caused by factors that are actually rather similar to what cause fungus gnats, which is, again, too much moisture, not enough light, not enough airflow. But something else to consider, I mentioned the importance of sterilization, especially if you're reusing containers. And this is one of the reasons you have to be so careful that if you use containers that have become contaminated, or they had soil in them that, had some of this, maybe some native soil from outside got introduced, or you came and worked the plants after touching stuff outside and got this stuff introduced, this can really, quickly wipe out a ton of your starts. So do be careful with this. This is why we say, even if it costs a little bit more, maybe to opt for the things that are sold new rather than trying to hack things into place and make them work. But again, it's whatever is in your practice is fine for you to use. So a few resources I do want to mention before we wrap up here, and then we can transition into a bit of a Q&A, because I see we've got quite a few comments have popped up there in the chat. But here we have a few books and a few sort of catalogs. So I think that's one of the greatest questions of, like, where do I even get seeds? I know I can go to Home Depot or Lowe's and they've got a rack of them, but what if you really want this, crazy variety that you keep talking about? So I would recommend, Johnny's Seeds. We've got a catalog here at the house, and I love just flipping through it. It's one of those things it's amazing to just kind of daydream about, all the amazing things you could grow if you had all the time and money in the world to put together your dream garden. But this is a great place to get started. They have physical catalogs as well as a nice full online catalog, but I think it's pretty great as well. The Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is another one. So this is the 2020 version. I'm not sure if the 2021 is out already, but this is another great way to, get access to some of these more interesting varieties, these heirloom varieties, as well as get some recommendations on planting times and planting practices. A great book that I had recommended to me somewhat recently is this one right over here, the New Seed Starters Handbook by Nancy Bubel, or Bubel. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. But regardless, this is regarded as, one of the greatest books for dialing in your seed starting practice and troubleshooting things. So even though I know we've covered a lot of ground today, there certainly is a lot more in terms of granular things that we could probably try and drill down on. And this is a great one if you really think you're going to be getting into seed starting to think about putting into your library. Speaking of libraries, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our own resources. Again, as part of the Cooperative Extension Service, we maintain an extensive online and print library of publications. And so you can find this by simply doing a quick Google search for UGA Extension Publications, or I think it might be, just publications.extension.uga.edu or something like that. Regardless, we have a full library there, and in particular, I've screenshotted, I think, what is one of the more useful ones written by Bob Westerfield, one of our horticulturalists. And this is called Vegetable Gardening in Georgia. We probably handed out maybe about a couple dozen of copies of this already coming into this year with folks getting their garden started. And I think this is another one that's great. It comes with a copy of our vegetable calendar, which will give you variety recommendations, which will give you planting depth and spacing recommendations. And I think it really is kind of a good one-stop shop for gardening in Georgia and getting a sense of things that we would recommend. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and call it.